Forget East Germany. The German nation has always extended far to the east of its current administrative boundaries. Prussia might have been the easternmost German territory, and Austria may be known as the Eastern Kingdom, but this was the real German frontier, a sprawling network of German villages, cities, and enclaves stretching farther than most could have ever imagined. For as long as can be traced back, the Slavs and the Germans have always had a bit of a testy relationship, and being neighbors in the continent of Europe certainly saw their periods of ups and downs, and one of the most interesting aspects of German history that I find was not the migration of Germans west to the Americas, but east to the fringes of Europe, and even some more exotic locales, with German ethnic enclaves still being present in places like the Caucasus, Central Asia, or even Siberia. This group of loosely affiliated ethnic German communities played a huge role in the political history of the surrounding countries and in major events such as the two world wars, although the Eastern Germans near completely disappeared in one of the most stunning vanishing acts in world history. Believe it or not, the history of these Slavic and Germanic peoples is actually fairly heavily intertwined, with Germanic and Slavic tribes intermixing for at least 2 millennia, as during the migration period of European history during the collapse of the Roman Empire, Germanic groups such as the Goths, Vandals, and many others began to stream south from Germania and Scandinavia into both halves of the Roman Empire, greatly contributing to the downfall and collapse of both. Subsets of the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths, were scattered in parts of the Balkans, Anatolia, and Crimea, as I discussed in an earlier video. In Crimean Gothic, a distinct Germanic language heavily influenced by Greek and Slavic, was actually the only one of the old Germanic populations to survive to the modern age. The Kievan Rus, one of the earliest major Eastern Slavic powers, actually owes its existence to Germanic peoples, as Oleg of Novgorod, a Varangian or Norse Viking, was responsible for conquering much of Rus in the 9th century AD, although Slavic was still the language used by the common folk, with the Germanic elite being assimilated in the following centuries. Very similar to the Italians, up until relatively recently, the German nation was actually divided between numerous tribes, kingdoms, and territories of varying size and power, with many of the German dialects spoken throughout being mutually unintelligible. But for nearly as long as the German nation has existed, there was always the continuous push of settlers east into parts unknown. Germans began migrating out of the Holy Roman Empire, which was centered around modern Germany, and west into Poland, Hungary, Romania, and later even as far as the Russian and Ottoman empires, forming their own villages, which were usually isolated from their host countries, essentially becoming German territorial enclaves, often following their own laws as opposed to local politics. For this reason, these German settlers very seldom were assimilated into the culture of these Eastern European countries, meaning that even 5th, 6th, 7th generation ethnic German citizens living in Ukraine or Russia would have still belonged to the Lutheran or Catholic Church as opposed to Eastern Orthodoxy, would often be fluent only in German, and for all intents and purposes would politically and socially quarantine themselves from the outside world. German settlers were attracted to this land in the first place because of the relatively burgeoning populations of their homeland in the west, and many who could not afford to make the trip to the New World instead turned to the vast steppes of the east, with many Slavic nations initially encouraging their migration with certain financial incentives, although would soon enough begin to see them as a threat. This process was especially amplified during the rule of Catherine the Great of Russia, a Prussian-born empress who strengthened relations between the nations of Russia and Germany and heavily encouraged mass German migration. In fact, much of Prussia arose as the direct result of the migration of thousands of Germans east into the homeland of the Baltic pagans, assimilating and replacing this population, and no other Western European power had the same ambitions of slowly colonizing Eastern Europe in a way, with the exception perhaps of the Italians, who had many small merchant colonies in the Balkans along the Mediterranean and Black Sea for centuries, although this was nowhere near the scope of German migration. The Austrian Empire, later evolving into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was a dual monarchy with a major German and Hungarian component. However, it is clear that the Germans had always been the dominant ethnic group in this so-called multi-ethnic empire, and this caused a variety of friction between the various ethnic groups, especially the Slavs, with the Yugoslavs of the south being especially antsy to gain independence from the Austrians and join their recently independent Serbian brothers to the south, and these frictions were directly responsible for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of the First World War. As mentioned, Austria-Hungary was extremely ethnically diverse, with ethnic Germans making up 1/4, Hungarians 1/5, Romanians and Italians 1/10 in total, and the remainder belonging to various Slavic groups such as the Czechs, Poles, or Ukrainians, although Germans were unique for being scattered throughout all regions of Austria-Hungary, even outside of the contiguous boundaries of the German ethnic nation, with pockets in Hungary, Vojvodina, which would later become a part of Serbia, Transylvania, which would later become a part of Romania, Ruthenia, which would later become a part of Ukraine, and especially Bohemia, which would later become a part of the independent Czechoslovakia. During the same time period, other areas where Germans were a prominent minority, or even sometimes a slight majority, were other parts of the Baltics, such as Latvia and Lithuania, known as Baltic Germans, the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine, where they were known as Crimean Germans, although it's important to distinguish that by this time the remainder of the fledgling Crimean Goths had been completely absorbed by the Crimean Tatar or Crimean German communities, and their language was extinct. However, one of the most fascinating and far-flung German ethnic enclaves in Eastern Europe had to have been the Volga Germans, a group who had inhabited the Volga region of Russia since the 1700s, having been a part of the German migrants invited to Russia by Catherine the Great, and these Volga Germans were Lutheran, Mennonite, or Catholic, in contrast to the Orthodox Russians or the Islamic Tatars and Kazakhs that surrounded them. The Volga Germans would gain official autonomy as the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Social Republic in the newly formed USSR in 1918, although they still remained as a part of the Russian SSR, although by this time the East was becoming increasingly intolerant of their German neighbors. Now, following World War I, German migration to this eastern front more or less stagnated, as you can imagine, with many blaming German aggression as the reason for the millions of lives lost during this great catastrophe, and the governments of many Eastern European countries began to look upon their German populations with distrust, viewing them as a potential third column, meaning their loyalties might lie with their motherland rather than their current countries. And these fears were not entirely unfounded, as the expansion of Nazi Germany before and during World War II was probably the biggest threat the Slavs had ever faced since the invasion of the Mongols 1,000 years before. Many, though not all, members of the Nazi Party had ambitions of greatly expanding the German nation eastward, conquering and assimilating the local Slavic population, a concept most know as Lebensraum. Seeing the Germanic race as superior, many National Socialists wished to use the German communities that already existed to the east as a stepping stone in the colonization of Eastern Europe and eventual incorporation into a new German superstate, and records show varying degrees of support for this plan from the actual German diaspora, but either way, civilian sympathizers and non-sympathizers alike ultimately paid the price. You have to understand that after yet another war of what was at least perceived as aggressive German expansionism, the amount of animosity and distrust towards not only German nationals, but anyone of the German ethnicity was very much palpable in literally all regions of Europe, and even as far away as the Americas, with anti-German sentiments persisting for years in the US and some Central American countries like Guatemala and Nicaragua, both of which had modest to large-sized German communities generations in the making. In the aftermath of World War II, with Germany being greatly reduced in territory, losing most of its former Prussian territory, an estimated 17 million Germans now found themselves at the mercy of a largely hostile army and an apathetic public. Atrocities were commonly committed by the advancing Soviet army against ethnic German civilians and captured prisoners of war alike, including rapes, murders, and forced labor. An estimated 9% of ethnic Germans perished either from massacres or disease and starvation on the long road from Eastern Europe to Germany. 6% left on their own accord in the following decades, with only 5% staying in Eastern Europe, and the remaining 80% being forcefully expelled to the newly formed East and West Germany. Interestingly, the German communities in Western Europe on the fringes of Belgium, as well as in Alsace-Lorraine and France and South Tyrol and Italy, were largely spared from any sort of government-sponsored pogroms, expulsion, or massacres, and are still around to the present day. Germans in the Soviet Union were especially discriminated against, with the Volga Autonomous SSR being dissolved and the Volga Germans scattered from their homeland, with many fleeing to America, particularly the Dakotas, while those who remained were scattered throughout Siberia, Central Asia, and other parts of the Union, with Germans reaching a high of 3% in Kyrgyzstan and 7% in Kazakhstan, while still having a soft presence in the latter country even today. Despite the desire for the expansion of the German nation by many in the Nazi Party, their actions were the direct cause of Germany losing immense amounts of land and the dramatic reduction in the size and scope of Germany's influence in Eastern Europe. Although the Holocaust has far more notoriety across the globe due to the atrocities committed during that genocide, the expulsion of the Germans from Eastern Europe was almost a silent ethnic cleansing, as despite being one of the largest mass migrations of people in history in the shortest time frame, this phase of Eastern European history has largely been forgotten by almost all in the West, other than those that it directly affected. The flight of ethnic Germans out of Eastern Europe and either to the United States or Germany has been heavily exacerbated in recent years, mostly due to the fall of communism, which has allowed a higher fluidity of movement out of these countries for Germans who have essentially been locked in for nearly half a century, although a small percentage of these communities have chosen to stay. I really do have to apologize for the breaking content, guys. I had just finished the script for a certain video and my computer crashed and corrupted the file, turning it into nothing but pound signs for some reason. And when I rewrote the script, the exact same thing happened again, and I just really felt like a loser at that point. But this video was certainly quite refreshing to make, and I'd certainly love to hear your opinions on the old German communities of Eastern Europe and their unfortunate ethnic cleansing and displacement after World War II. For today's poll, let me know which of these lost German communities piques your interest the most, and as always, this has been Mason. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.